Welcome everyone to Frank Analysis. My name is Franco. I am honored to have here joining me today Mark Charles, who is running as an independent candidate for the United States of America. I thank you so much for taking your time to be here today. Mark Charles, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me. Please let me introduce myself traditionally. So Yate, Mark Charles Yunishia, Sin Bakadana Nishle, the Tohiglini Basichin, Sin Bakadana Dasiche, the Toluchitni Dasinella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our four clans. We're matrilineal as a people with our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sin Bakadana Nishle. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sinbake Dina. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Toluchitni. It's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also just want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you today from Washington, D.C., where I live with my family. And these are the lands of the Piscataway. This is the nation that lived here. They hunted here, they farmed here, they fished here, they raised their families here, they buried their dead here. They were here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they are still here. They are the host people of these lands, and I am humbled and honored to be living on these lands stewarded by them. So I want to honor the Piscataway people and thank them for their stewardship of these lands all of these hundreds, even thousands of years.
Yeah, and I also live very close by to DC. It really is a beautiful land. Rock Creek Park is a beautiful place, and I recommend other people to come here and check it out. It's a really lovely place to be. So I would like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your experiences, all of which led you to motivate you to run for office.
Yeah, so I grew up in New Mexico, which is in the Southwest, and I grew up primarily on a mission. I don't want to say compound, but on a mission of the Christian Reformed Church. They came to New Mexico in the early 1900s, like 1903, 1904, and established both a reservation mission school, a boarding school, as well as a church and eventually a hospital. And my father's parents, my Navajo father, his parents worked for the missionaries as translators, and my mother came to that mission as a nurse and met my father, and they ended up getting married, and that's how I came into the world. And so I grew up in this mission setting on right on the border of the Navajo Nation near Gallup, New Mexico, and attending the school that was transitioning from being a boarding school into becoming a day school. There were both day and boarding school students at the school when I was there in the 1970s and 80s, and it was transitioning into becoming a day school after being a boarding school for nearly 100 years. And so I graduated from there and went to school for my undergrad at UCLA. I graduated from UCLA in 1995 with my bachelor's in history, and then moved around. I was in Albuquerque, I was in Los Angeles, I was in San Francisco, eventually moved back to Gallup and then to Denver, where I was the pastor of a small church called the Christian Indian Center. And that's where I really began wrestling with the issue of kind of the colonization of indigenous peoples by the church, and how the church had basically used religion to forcibly assimilate Native peoples, indigenous peoples to Western European culture. And so began on a journey of understanding what's known as contextualizing worship. What does it mean to be a Christian, but to contextualize it for your own culture, your own, especially indigenous perspective of worldview and understanding what's sacred and everything else. And that journey led me to move back to the Navajo Nation with my wife and our young son. And for 3 years, we lived in a very remote section of our reservation. We were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. We were living in a one-room hogan, no running water, no electricity. We were in a community that was very traditional or very disconnected or very rural. And we were in that community for 3 years. When we moved there, we were prepared to live off the grid. We were prepared to haul our water and cook by camp stove. We were prepared to use an outhouse and, live by candlelight. And we geared ourselves up for that. What we weren't prepared for was the intense marginalization that you feel when you live and move to an Indian reservation. As I said, I grew up at a border town to the reservation. I never lived on the reservation before. And it really surprised me. In fact, one of the earliest observations I made in that first year we were there was primarily the only non-natives we ever saw were people who came to take our picture or people who came to give us charity. Almost no one came for the sake of building a relationship and just wanting to get to know us as a people. And I was wrestling at the same time with understanding more of the history and experiencing and observing the historical trauma of our people from both the boarding schools and the ethnic cleansing that the U.S. government did to Native nations and Native peoples. And I was learning about what's known as the doctrine of discovery. I was exposed to it through the writings of some other Native authors. There was one author in particular whose work I highly respect. His name is Stephen Newcomb, who wrote a book called Pagans in the Promised Land about the doctrine of discovery, and I began researching this doctrine myself. And that was when I began kind of wrestling with, how do I talk about these issues? When I would talk with my non-Native friends, I would talk about this history and talk about what had happened to our peoples. And every time the subject came up, I could feel kind of the emotion and even the anger welling up in me. And eventually I'd have to drop out of the conversation, hang up the phone, or change the subject, because I didn't want to start yelling at my friends. So I learned how to kind of disconnect, how to talk about it like I read it in the newspaper. But then I realized the more I could talk about it, the longer I could stay in the conversation, it was their defenses going up. We didn't do that to your people. That wasn't my family that did those things. And soon they would hang up the phone. I didn't know how to engage the conversation in a way that kept both people in the discussion. And one day I was writing a letter to my friends. It was like the 10th time, trying to get them to understand how it felt to be Native American, living on a reservation in the middle of the United States of America. And in my letter, I said, it feels like our Native peoples are this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. They since have come upstairs and unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later and we're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, the thing that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. I wrote that, and I'm like, that's it. That's what I'm feeling. And I shared that with people in my community, people living on the reservation near me. And some of the feedback I got was, I've lived here for a long time. It's hard to articulate how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I started sharing that with non-natives. And instead of coming back defensively, they would come back and say, how do we say thank you? What does it look like for my family, my community, my church, my city, my state, my country to express gratitude to the indigenous hosts of Turtle Island? See, now we're having a very different conversation. Instead of talking about victim versus oppressor, now we're talking about, which is what I think is the crux of the problem, which is this reversal of roles. Where we have this nation that considers itself to be a nation of immigrants, most of them from Europe, who've never asked for, nor have they ever been given permission to be here. And they live here like they own the place. Meanwhile, you have 6 million indigenous peoples who have been pushed aside, marginalized, put onto reservations, and are treated like unwanted guests in someone else's house. We need to learn how to reverse those roles. We need this nation to understand whether people came over on the Mayflower or whether they crossed the border a week ago, that in some very real and practical ways, they are guests in someone else's house. And I want our indigenous peoples to understand that in some very real and practical ways, we are the host people of the land, and we have to conduct ourselves as the host. I also want to acknowledge the very unique context or situation that the African American community finds itself in, who are neither immigrants nor indigenous. Rather, they were kidnapped, stolen from their own lands, and then brought here and enslaved. And so they don't fit into the narrative either, because they're neither indigenous to these lands nor are they immigrants to these lands. But they have a very distinct and unique history here, which needs to be acknowledged in the narrative of our country. You know, the fact that our country calls itself a nation of immigrants, and the two groups that disrupt that narrative are indigenous peoples who were here before Columbus got lost at sea, and African Americans, many of whose ancestors were kidnapped and brought here and enslaved.
Yeah, so I watched your presidential ad, and I thought it was a very powerful video. And one of the main messages that you have there in that video is that we need to change the Constitution or rewrite the Constitution. And many Americans have been conditioned to believe in American exceptionalism, either consciously or unconsciously. So how do you plan on convincing people about changing the Constitution, and how do you plan on spreading that message?
Yeah. So one of the things I talk about all the time, and one of the things I'm actually working for, is we live in this country, but we have huge challenges. As I said, we call ourselves a nation of immigrants, which is not entirely accurate. There's a native leader, his name is George Erasmus. He's Dene, it's a tribe in Canada. And he used this quote when talking about truth and reconciliation in Canada. And he said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community, he says, you have to start by creating a common memory. That quote gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, especially, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers a mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. We have communities of color, Native Americans, African Americans, Latino, other communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of boarding schools and Indian massacres, of internment camps and segregation, of mass incarceration and families being ripped apart at the borders. And there's no common memory. And there's no point in American history where there was healthy community across racial lines especially. And our foundations go into that. Most people think our foundations hold a promise of equality. That's the belief. They believe they hold a promise of equality, that this country was created for all people. But if you read the Declaration of Independence, which starts very boldly by saying we declare these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, keep reading the document 30 lines later, and you will find that that very same document refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers use that inclusive term all men is because they have a narrow definition of who's actually human. The Constitution, which also begins boldly with the words, we the people of the United States are to form a more perfect union. Article 1, Section 2, again, just a few lines later, the section that determines who is and who is not a part of the Constitution, who is and who is not protected by this document, never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? In 1787, when the document was signed, that literally left white men. And technically it was white landowning men who could vote. So I tell people, most people think that, yes, our foundations hold a promise for everybody. It doesn't. It does not hold a promise for anyone except white landowning men. And if you don't believe me, get on a Zoom call with women, African Americans, and Native Americans and read the Constitution out loud. You will be embarrassed and appalled at how racist and sexist and white supremacist this document actually is. Even the 13th Amendment, which most people think abolished slavery, what it reads is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted shall exist within the United States. The 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery, it redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
So after the lynching of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department just a few months ago, we had a very robust debate about policing. President Trump suggested we ban a few chokeholds. Joe Biden suggested we learn how to train our officers how to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. And I'm the only candidate who's saying if we want to reform our criminal justice system, we have to start by abolishing slavery. The reason we see the problems we see in our policing is because the criminal justice system is where white supremacy is constitutionally protected. It's where slavery is still legal, and we incarcerate our citizens at the highest rate of any country in the world, and we incarcerate our people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate we incarcerate white people. Why? Because that's where slavery is legal. That's where we've been able to codify and institutionalize our white supremacy. And so if we want to deal with those issues in our policing, we have to first abolish slavery. And neither President Trump nor Joe Biden are interested in having that conversation.
So I think that one of the many reasons for why many Americans believe in this American exceptionalism is stemmed not only by the media that we consume, for example, the movies that glorify white saviorism and Americans in war and action movies, but also because of the way we're taught in school. The lobbyists have a stranglehold on the education system so that we're taught to not question our government and that our leaders have our best interests in mind. So as president, what do you plan on doing about our education system?
I published a book just a few months ago. It was in November of 2019. It's titled Unsettling Truth: The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. Myself and my co-author, Sing-Chan Ra, go into depth about the doctrine of discovery, actually going back into the Christian church history, all the way back to the birth of Jesus, and especially looking at the 4th century with the rise of Christendom, this creation of a Christian empire, and how that led into the writing of this doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is this series of papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493. It says things like, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and to their use and profit. So essentially the church in Europe, saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman, and their land is yours for the taking. There's a quote by one of our presidents. What he said is, he said, I have no intention of making voters or jurors of black people. I have no intention of allowing them to be judges or jurors, or allowing them to hold office or to intermarry. So there's a physical difference between the white and black races, which forever forbids you from living in terms of social and political equality. And as long as they have to remain together, there must be the distinction between superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, believe that the superior position belongs to the white race. That quote was spoken by Abraham Lincoln, who was a blatant white supremacist and who committed some of the worst genocide against Native peoples of any president in the United States history. He was a blatant white supremacist, and we hold him up as one of our greatest presidents. Why? In the book, one of the things I point out is that one of the big challenges America faces is that we've never lost a war that matters. Almost every major international conflict that we've been involved in, even domestic, we've won. And the victors write the history. The victors write the history. So we've written our own history for 250 years, which means we've created these mythologies, these narratives that are not even close to being rooted in the truth. Just a week and a half ago was the 75th anniversary of the nuclear bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We barely said a peep about it in our country. They held memorials in Japan. Our nation literally after we broke a treaty, we pulled out of a treaty with Iran, the nuclear treaty signed by the Obama administration. Last week, Secretary of State Pompeo went to the United Nations Security Council and demanded that they go back and they reinstate sanctions against Iran for a treaty that we pulled out of. What gives us the arrogance to not only pull out of a treaty and then think we can still enforce it, but what gives us the authority to tell any nation in this world they can or cannot have nuclear weapons? We're the only country in the world that actually dropped nuclear weapons on civilians. We killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in the last few months of World War II. And actually, the worst bombing wasn't even Nagasaki or Hiroshima. It was Operation Meeting House, the carpet bombing of Tokyo. We killed over 100,000 civilians in one night alone in that bombing. We didn't even use nuclear weapons there. In fact, McNamara, who went on to become the Secretary of Defense, he was working as an analyst for General LeMay in the Pacific Theater in World War II. And he was helping analyze their bombing strategies and making recommendations of how they could make them more effective. And in the documentary about him, The Fog of War, he said that in the final months of the war, General LeMay said to them that if we lost the war, they would be tried as war criminals. And McNamara agreed. He said he was right. We were behaving as war criminals. Instead, we honored him. We gave McNamara a medal at the end of the war. Why? Because we won the war. That's the only difference. Yeah. We won the war, so our actions weren't criminal, even though they clearly were. So this is the challenge we face in my book, I have 2 chapters on trauma. And I talk about how, yes, we have the historical trauma, which is rooted in the PTSD, a post-traumatic stress, which afflicts our communities of color in some very powerful ways. But I also talk about what's known as a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, PITS. And I talk about how this sort of trauma, which doesn't come from being a victim of a horrifying event, it comes from perpetrating the horrifying event. That this trauma has definitely afflicted white Americans who built a nation on 500 years of vile, dehumanizing injustice. And one of the things I identify is that American exceptionalism. Yeah. The myth of American exceptionalism is a coping mechanism for a nation that's in deep denial of its genocidal past as well as its current racist reality. Americans, especially white Americans, have to believe they're exceptional, because if they're not, if they don't have some unique relationship with God and some special standing in the global order of things, if they don't have a manifest destiny which is rooted in the legacy of promised lands given to Old Testament Israel, which actually gave them the right to commit genocide, if they don't have that sort of mythology that makes them exceptional, then they are merely another colonial, genocidal, dehumanizing group of people. Mm-hmm. And that's unfathomable to them. So American exceptionalism is the coping mechanism for a nation in deep denial of its genocidal past as well as its current racist reality. This is why American exceptionalism is one of the most unifying themes in American politics. Because American politics is run by white landowning men, and especially if you're a person of color and you want white landowning men to support you and vote for you and even fund you, you first need to tell them how exceptional they are. This is the rule of politics. This is why American politics is such a unifying theme and used politically by both parties, even including people of color, which is what makes our campaign incredibly different. Because I do not, for a moment, affirm American exceptionalism. And I actually challenge our nation on these things that we think were so great about our past, so great about our history. And I'm working hard to help us create a more accurate common memory so that we can have a better community moving forward.
So this American exceptionalism in our education system and in our media is also a tool for manufacturing people's consent to get in all of these regime change wars, install all of these coups, and implementing sanctions. And the excuse is always that there's a dictator in a country that is suppressing their democracy and we want to bring them democracy. Yet we're allied with nations like Israel and Saudi Arabia, which commit acts of genocide and oppression. Currently, right now, the U.S. is bombing 8 different countries. So what are your stances on foreign policy?
One of the nominations I'm looking most forward to making is I want to nominate a Native American person as my Secretary of State. Not only do I want the White House, the president, to be Native in myself, but I want our primary ambassador to the world to be Native. I just released a YouTube video. I did a live stream just 2 days ago, and we archived it on our YouTube channel, Mark Charles 2020. And the title of that live stream was, "For United States foreign policy is rooted in the lie of white supremacy." If white supremacy is the injustice, the myth, the lie that our nation has believed since its inception, and it has so drastically affected our domestic policies, our incarceration rates, our history of enslavement, our history of genocide, it absolutely has a similar impact on our foreign policy, especially our foreign policy towards nations of color who aren't white. If we look at some of our closest allies in NATO, some of our closest allies are also colonial nations. France, Germany, Holland, the UK, all deeply, deeply colonial nations. At one point, Western Europe colonized much of the world. And yet today they're our closest allies. Why? Because we've all reformed so greatly? No, because we are all still incredibly colonial. I would love to have deep conversations with the prime ministers of these nations, with the kings and queens of these countries, about the way they colonized even these lands known as Turtle Island. At one point, France was the largest colonial landholder in the New World, in North America. The Louisiana Purchase. That whole strip of land that was sold for $15 million to the United States from France was claimed because they landed at the mouth of the Mississippi River and discovered it, which gave them access to all the lands up along that whole rivershed. Lands which they sold, which include hundreds of thousands of native peoples. And so, again, we have to acknowledge that not only is our own history deeply, deeply dehumanizing and colonial, but so is the history of some of our closest allies. And we have to begin to not only acknowledge that, but deal with it. One of the things I point out, especially about our relationship with Israel, in 2015, when the Obama administration was working to negotiate a new treaty, a nuclear treaty with Iran, Prime Minister Netanyahu came to the United States to lobby against that nuclear deal. And he spoke controversially to a joint session of Congress. He was not invited by the president to do this. He was invited by the Speaker of the House, which was against protocol. Usually it's a president who invites foreign leaders to come. But this happened, and he gave the speech. He was talking again, just like Congress is today. It was incredibly partisan, very divided. And Prime Minister Netanyahu had to get everyone on the same page behind him. So early in his speech, he hit on one of the most unifying themes in U.S. politics, which is American exceptionalism. And he said to our Congress members, because the United States and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. That promised land is what's at the root of our understanding as a nation of manifest destiny. If you read about the theology of promised lands in the Old Testament, when God gave Israel promised lands, his command of what to do with the people in those promised lands, the Canaanites who lived there, was to kill them all. Leave no man, no woman, no child left alive. Because both the modern nation state of Israel and the United States of America claims this sort of exceptionalism, this understanding of promised lands, this has created a very codependent and dysfunctional relationship between the modern nation state of Israel and the United States of America. That really has nothing to do with freedom or equality. It's built on this misappropriation of promised land. We need Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised lands to justify what we did to Native Americans and African Americans. And the modern nation state of Israel needs our continuing flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they are doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. It's a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship rooted in this misapplication of a theology of promised lands. And it's created a very codependent, dysfunctional relationship that we need to deal with. But first, we have to root ourselves of this notion of our own exceptionalism, and especially of our lie of white supremacy.
So one of the things that the duopoly of the Democratic and Republican Party seem to agree on is on our imperialistic foreign policy. So can you tell us if this was one of the reasons for why you chose to run as an independent instead of trying to run within one of these parties to try to change it from within, as some of the outsider Democratic presidential candidates did? And what is your stance on political parties?
Yeah, the two political parties, the reason the United States of America has a very simplistic two-party system is because that's the way the oligarchy has found the best way to maintain the status quo. The two-party system actually agrees on most of our colonial values, including white supremacy. I have a TEDx talk that I gave about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, in 2018. And the TEDx talk is titled, "We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History." And I go into depth into a few Supreme Court cases discussing land titles. The first one was in 1823, where it literally became the basis for land titles. And it stated that basically because natives were savages, we were only occupants of the land. And Europeans were fully human, and they had the right of discovery to the land. And they stated clearly land titles were based on discovery. But though natives were here first, because we were savages and just occupants, we didn't have the right to the land. Europeans did because they had the right of discovery to the land. That case creates the legal precedent for land titles, and it literally by name references the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery gets referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. In that TEDx talk, I go in depth into that 2005 case, helping people see how it is one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. Does everything but call natives savages today, references the doctrine of discovery in the first footnote of the case, and states that natives do not have sovereignty to their land, that those embers have long ago grown cold. And that opinion was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Right? And she's the liberal voice on the left, the voice of dissent in a very conservative-leaning Supreme Court. Why is she advocating for this? There was another case literally a month ago that came out, McGirt versus Oklahoma, where in that opinion, Neil Gorsuch, who is an expert in Indian law, he wrote that opinion, and in that opinion, he literally stated that the United States Congress has, anytime they can muster the will, and I'm quoting him there, they have the right to break treaty and disestablish reservations from native nations, and nobody, including the Supreme Court, will hold them accountable. And that opinion was also signed by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Why? Because when your land titles are based on a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value. And I promise you, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have any interest in changing that precedent. Joe Biden, just a few months ago, in 2015, I think it was, the Obama administration established reservation lands for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in Massachusetts. Earlier this year, during the pandemic, the Trump administration disestablished those reservation lands. This is akin to basically throwing renters out of their apartment during a hurricane. I mean, it's unfathomably unjust. And there was outcry from all sectors. Mm-hmm. And even Joe Biden wrote, he wrote an article, he addressed it in a blog that he published on Medium. And in his blog, he stated how he and President Obama had established these reservation lands. Now, reservation lands are not lands owned by tribes. Almost no tribe owns their reservation lands. They are lands held in trust for us by the federal government. Why? Again, the doctrine of discovery. We are mere occupants of the land. The U.S. is the true title holder. So reservation lands are not owned by reservations. They are held in trust by the federal government. And in his response to the injustice of disestablishing the reservation lands of the Mashpee Wampanoag by the Trump administration in 2020, Joe Biden said to Native nations, he said, one of the most solemn responsibilities of the president of the U.S. government is to hold lands in trust on behalf of Native nations. It's one of the best ways to establish your own sovereignty. I'm not quoting that exactly, but that's the sentiment he wrote. Imagine if he said that to any other nation. Right. Imagine if Joe Biden said, France, the best thing for you to have good relationship with the U.S. government is to let us hold your lands in trust. It's critical to your sovereignty to allow. Now, those words at best are laughable, at worst are words of war. But he said that to Native nations. Why? Because of the foundational level acceptance of this dehumanizing doctrine of discovery. And so this is where, both sides, this is a bipartisan value. And neither side is interested in addressing the root of the problem. This is why I'm running as an independent. Because I knew if I ran as a Democrat or a Republican, they would, A, never nominate me. And again, the two parties run their primaries through the states of Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa, which is the sixth widest state in the country, New Hampshire is with the fourth. Iowa, which has the largest percentage of private lands of any state in the country. New Hampshire, which has the highest percent of home ownership. Both states dominated by white landowning men, and this is where both parties run their primaries through, literally making white landowning men the gatekeeper for presidential politics. I knew there'd be very little chance, just like what happened this year. We had a year ago one of the most diverse pool of candidates that the Democratic Party has ever seen. More women, more people of color, more members of LGBTQIA2S+ on the field. And one of the least dynamic, one of the least impressive, even by his own wife's admittance, when she said, I know your candidate may be better on issues like healthcare than my husband is, but we have to decide who is going to get elected. Right. Why? Because who is going to do the electing? It's the white landowning men. Yeah. She admitted her husband was not as good on the issues, but he was going to be the one to make it through that process, and sure enough, come October, November, December, the candidates of color began dropping out. By the end of the year, end of 2019, all of the candidates of color had been removed from the debate stage. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party is changing their rules so that Michael Bloomberg can enter the debate stage without having any donors. And then they removed all the women. Soon we're left with two white landowning men from the 1%, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And Joe Biden was the choice of the establishment. And so he's the one who won. Mm-hmm. The least dynamic, the least impressive, the least progressive of any of the candidates on the stage. And yet he won. And if you listened even last week at the DNC, everyone who endorsed him, Julian Castro, Bernie Sanders, everyone who endorsed him admitted that they did not see eye to eye with Joe Biden. Julian Castro said, yes, we have disagreements on immigration. Bernie Sanders, yes, we have disagreements on healthcare. And when pressed on those disagreements, the almost universal response was, well, at least he's better than Donald Trump. So this is the problem. The bar is incredibly low for white landowning men to enter into presidential politics. Elizabeth Warren was incredibly well prepared with all of her policies. Bernie Sanders had incredible vision. Andrew Yang thought outside of the box. Kamala Harris and Cory Booker had incredible passion. All of these candidates were removed from the stage so that the white landowning male from the 1% could stand up. I'm going to lead this. So this is why I didn't run as a Democrat. I knew that was going to happen, and I actually wanted to be in the general election. I actually want to win. And I knew had I run as a Democrat or Republican, I would never even be allowed to get this far. And so, yes, even though I raise less money, even though I have a smaller platform, even though I have less name awareness, I right now have a greater chance of being president in 2021 than anyone except for Joe Biden, who ran as a Democrat. I'm still here. Right. We're still talking about my issues. And if you compare, one of the most powerful campaign tools we have is the 9-minute announcement video that we released 15 months ago. I literally get regular emails, messages from people. I just found your campaign video. I've watched the whole 9 minutes, and I'm sitting here in tears because it's given me hope again for politics in the U.S. People write me and they're bewildered. How could I have never heard of you? You are hitting all of the issues that need to be discussed right now, and you're saying the best things about them, and nobody is covering you. This is absolutely true. The press has literally ignored me. They have literally written me out of stories where we've been at events and they've refused to cover us. And so, but when you compare vision, when you compare a plan, when you compare what it is we're actually working towards, our campaign, hands down, has the best vision. Donald Trump wants to make America great again. Joe Biden wants to restore the soul of America. I want to do something our nation has never done before. I want to build a nation where for the very first time, we the people actually means all the people. The only people who can look back on America and say it was great, the only people who can look back and say, oh, I love the soul of America, is white landowning men. Women did not have a great history in this country. Native Americans, African Americans, people of color didn't have a great history here. LGBTQIA2S+ did not have a great history here. The soul of America, enslaved, committed genocide against these groups of people. So I want to do something which actually speaks, is attractive to everyone who's on the margins, which is I want to build a nation that actually includes them. And I want to do it at a foundational level. Our first 100-day plan, on our website, on our blog, if you go to our blog on our website and read our first 100-day plan, we have a plan to remove the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy from our Constitution in the first 100 days in office.
So what made you want to run as an independent with no party affiliation instead of running in the Green or Libertarian Party?
Again, because we're dealing with land titles, because we're dealing with foundational level issues. Over the past 10 years, I've partnered with many organizations. I partnered with many different groups of people. At some point or another, they all come to the point, and it usually happens around some sort of systemic issue, immigration, land titles, something else like that. And eventually they say to me, you can't say that. You can't go there. And I want to say these things. And so one of the best ways I found to do it is to keep my voice as independent as possible. Mm-hmm. People are attracted to what I'm trying to do. People see the vision of what we're trying to accomplish. Institutions hate it. Institutions need these systemic systems to keep themselves in play. People are much more open to changing the foundations. So by running as an independent, yes, I don't have as loud as a platform, I'm not covered by the media as much, but I have the best opportunity to keep my message as pure as it needs to be so that the people who are most afflicted, most affected by these injustices, by these foundations, can actually have a chance at real systemic change.
So the two-party duopoly, they're indeed suppressing the other smaller parties and independent candidates. There's also reports of shady behavior of voter suppression and missing ballots that happened not just in the primaries in 2016, and the mysterious shadow app that occurred in Iowa in 2020, but also in local congressional primary elections. The establishment is afraid of progressive candidates that pose a threat to their status quo. So what will you do about election integrity both before and after you take office?
Well, again, so both parties are terrified of democracy. Republicans are afraid of voters, and Democrats are afraid of other candidates. They're terrified of anyone else running against their uninspiring candidates. And so they both try to suppress the two, right? Even if you listen to the DNC, in her remarks, which we see great, were received incredibly well by our nation. Even Michelle Obama marginalized people who were running outside the two-party system, right?
Yeah.
This is the problem. Change will never come from the center. It won't. The Democrats will be on a continual 250-year trajectory towards equality for people, taking baby steps the entire way. They have no interest in deep systemic change. And so the things we need to do, we actually need to acknowledge and fight for democratic values. We need to acknowledge that voters are important. So is a diversity of candidates, just as important. The two-party system, again, it exists to protect the status quo, which includes itself. Part of the two-party system is the status quo. And so the two-party system does everything it can to marginalize voters who might vote outside of that system, and to marginalize candidates who try to run outside of that system. That's how the two-party system maintains its dominance. And so we need to have better access not only to the polling booth. I think, registering to vote should be a given, should be automatic. And making sure we can have accessibility to voting. Election day should be a federal holiday. We need to do everything. We need to have not only be able to vote by mail. We're in the 21st century, right? We can do our banking through computers. It's unfathomable to me and to most Gen Z millennials that we can vote electronically. Like, this makes no sense to anybody except white landowning men from the boomer generation, right? They're the ones who can't figure this out. And so yeah, we need to make sure that everybody in America has an accessibility to voting. And we also need to make sure that people who have a legitimate desire to run have an access to the ballot and can get on the, as running as independent, we've been trying to get on the ballot in all 50 states. We're going to make it on 2 of them. Part of this is the pandemic. Part of this is being left out of the media. Part of this is just the challenges of running in an independent, in a 2-party system. We'll be on 2 ballots, and we'll be writing candidates in hopefully between 35 and 36 states is what we're hoping for, which still gives us more than 270 access to more than 270 votes in the Electoral College, so we can still win. And I'm telling people, yeah, if you want the change our campaign is talking about, you better believe you're going to have to write a name in. This type of change is never going to come from a checkbox. If you want to live in a nation where we the people truly means all the people, you need to prepare yourself that if you want that type of change, you're going to have to write that name in. The system will never put that in a checkbox. Way too simple. And so we have to change the way people think about what we're trying to do. You know, so many people say I'm a protest candidate. I will freely admit my odds of winning are not great. But if I was a true protest candidate, I would have done exactly what Bernie Sanders is. I would have run as a Democrat. That's what a protest candidate does.
Right.
Someone who really wants change. Someone who really wants, not just to get to the Oval Office, but to actually be able to enact change once they get there, they have to run outside the system.
So one of the crises that we are dealing with right now is the environmental crisis. So what would you do about this crisis, and is there a root cause that you think that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are not addressing?
Yeah. The challenge we face environmentally, and this is huge, right? We are literally driving towards a cliff environmentally. Even the Paris Climate Agreement, which most people agree is not even aggressive enough, is calling for a 50% reduction in carbon output by 2030 and a carbon neutral output by 2050, I believe the numbers are. So if you look back over the last 6 months of our global life, where literally the world has shut down, COVID-19 has caused massive shutdown of economies all around the world. Manufacturing is down, gas production is down, travel is down, like it's massive. And carbon output has decreased by 17%, which is not even half of where we need to be by 2030. And see how painful the past 6 months have been, right?
Yeah.
The jobs loss, the change in plans, the new normal that we're living in. This has been incredibly painful, and we've only reduced our carbon output by 17%. Can you imagine how painful it's going to be to get to 50%?
Yeah.
Or to 100% to carbon neutral? We're talking drastic changes. And right now, both parties are centering the economy. The Republicans are bragging that they've built the greatest economy, well, at least before March, our country's ever seen. And they had some good stats, right? We had 11 years of a bull market. We had low unemployment. We had massively high corporate profits. But the pandemic showed us really well that economy isn't working. Even today, right? Wall Street has recovered and Main Street's in tatters. Wall Street has more than made up the losses they had from COVID-19. Our billionaires have increased their wealth by hundreds of billions of dollars. Meanwhile, Congress can't even decide if they want to pay unemployment benefits to the tens of millions of people who lost their jobs or are underemployed due to the worst economic downturn in a century. And so, clearly the economy is not working, but the Republicans are bragging that they built the greatest economy ever, and they did it while completely destroying and neglecting the environment. They reduced regulations. They opened up land for drilling, like complete disrespect. And that's easy, right? If you want to make a lot of money, yes, by all means, exploit your environment. That's probably the easiest way to do it. That's no small feat. Anyone can do that. That doesn't take a genius to do that. But that's what the Republicans are saying. The Democrats, on the other hand, are telling their supporters that we can have a prosperous economy while we save the environment. And through the jobs they'll create through the Green New Deal, through the new industries they're going to explore, and blah, 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 everything else. But they're promising, the start of their promise is they are going to have a prosperous economy while we save the environment. So both parties are centering the economy.
Yeah.
Now, when the pandemic hit, we had to quickly decenter our economy in order to deal with the pandemic. We had to shut businesses down. We had to make massive adjustments in very short periods of time in order to keep ourselves alive during this pandemic. We had to decenter our economy, and that was painful. When the crisis of the environment hits, we will not be able to keep our economy centered. Now, people are incredibly resilient. They're able to adapt, they're able to change, they're able to adjust. Everyone's afraid of change, but when it actually happens, when you are forced to change, people are incredibly resilient.
Yeah.
But they have to be prepared for that change. If we promise Americans there will be very little change, it will be seamless, it will be painless, it will just be a small hiccup, you'll just have to learn how to drive a battery-powered car instead of a gas-powered car. Everything else will be the same. You can still prosper, you can still live your lifestyle, you can do everything you want. That's not true.
It isn't.
The American lifestyle is not sustainable. We are 1/5 of the world's population. We consume 25 to 30% of the world's resources. The American lifestyle absolutely is not sustainable. If we want to live sustainably, we have to reduce our consumption massively. If we want to save the environment, we have to reduce it even more than just to a sustainable level, just to make the gains back of what we've been doing for the past 250 years. And so I'm the only candidate that I know of who is actually trying to prepare people and say, yeah, I don't want to leave anyone behind, but what we're going to be doing as we deal with this economy is not going to be called prospering.
Right.
We're trying to save lives here. We're trying to save a globe. And that's going to require some very real sacrifice. Not just from the bottom, where the oligarchy is used to extracting the sacrifice, but from every single level. It's going to require challenging and difficult sacrifice. And if we prepare our people for this, again, people are incredibly resilient. No one likes change, and even people are even hesitant to intentionally walk into change. But when change happens, people are able to adapt, especially if they're prepared for it. So my strategy, different from the Democrats and the Republicans, is I am telling people, yeah, we have to be willing and ready to make difficult choices. We're not going to leave anyone behind, but we have to make some drastic changes, including to our value system.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. And one of the things that I say on this show is that as long as we continue to have this current neoliberal system, which is tied to capitalism, and both candidates do the bidding of the corporations, then that is directly tied also with imperialism and the overexploitation of resources, which is tied to the destruction of the planet. So I thank you so much, Mark Charles, for coming on the show. I wish I could talk to you more time. Is there anything else you would like to address before we close off here?
Yeah, I'll end with this because this is important to understand. Over the last year, we've heard a lot of really innovative proposals from the Democratic Party about what most of them didn't come from Joe Biden. Most of them came from the other candidate, right? Bernie Sanders talked about Medicare for all. Elizabeth Warren talked about really taking on the corporate entities. Didn't have much integrity in talking that way, but she talked that way at least. Andrew Yang talked a lot about universal basic income. Now the challenge, and all of these are great ideas. I love the thinking out of the box. I love the way that they're trying to approach these problems. The challenge is the way most of them addressed in some way paying for them was by taxing billionaires. Now, the problem with taxing billionaires is you need an economy that continues to produce billionaires. So you're creating massive income inequality so you can address income inequality. That doesn't work. I would much rather figure out how do we invest in and create an economy that doesn't create billionaires. Mm-hmm. How do we actually factor in not things that can be taxed, but real costs? Like UBI, right? Innovation, technology, automation, artificial intelligence, these are going to make work more efficient, correct? Which is going to mean jobs will be less in demand. As we get more efficient at things, we will need less people working on them. So one of the costs of automation is jobs, right? It's going to cost jobs, which is going to make more money for the corporation because they now have to hire less people. So rather than just taxing them, and when you tax someone, what you're saying is you can earn your money, we're just going to claw some of it back. I want to actually factor in these other costs into the practice of doing business. So if your business is able to automate and find more efficient ways to do things, that's fantastic. But you know what? Because you're a part of this nation and we're not just a collection of individuals, we are a corporate entity. We are a communal entity where we need one another to exist. Part of the financial cost of you doing business is you need to help deal with the loss of jobs. So this is the problem, is right now corporate entities can find more efficient ways to do something, hire less people, and just increase their profits. Meanwhile, dumping the needs of those people onto the government. We need to completely rethink how we incorporate. Well, what is the real cost of doing business? You know, right now, Apple, I think they reached $2 trillion in market capitalization. We need to deal with this. If we don't deal with this, then the oligarchy that Jimmy Carter said we have is only going to increase. So this is where, while I love the innovative thinking of these candidates, I want to be more creative than just finding ways to fund these programs by taxing billionaires. Yeah. Because I don't want to continue producing billions. I intend to have a very robust debate on how ethical and moral is it to have billionaires in the first place. I don't think you can ethically and morally be a billionaire in today's world. You can't. Yeah, and no one can earn $1 billion. No one's labor is worth $1 billion. And if you're making your $1 billion, not only requires you to have high-paid executives, but requires you to have janitors and maintenance people working on your factory floors, and you're paying those people as if they were expendable, and your executives as if they're indispensable, there's a problem. So this is where we have to even redefine what it means to have essential workers, and how do we pay essential workers. Right? We identified, this pandemic helped us identify who's essential. Well, it turns out it's not the corporate executives who are that essential. It's cashier clerks and delivery people and nurses and teachers and doctors. These people are essential. And most of these people, not all of them, but most of them are working for minimum wage, which is not even livable. Yeah. So we have to, if we're going to identify someone as essential, we have to pay them like they're essential.
It's truly.
And if we're gonna protect corporations from liability, we have to find ways to actually hold them accountable.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's incomprehensible how much money, these billionaires have, most of which they're not even gonna use. And the
Yeah.
majority of the wealth that they make is because of the people that work for them, like the essential workers that you mentioned. I think you
Yeah.
have a very, very powerful message. I thank you again so much for coming on the show. I appreciate the time and again the message that you shared with us today. And I wish you all the best in your journey to make this a more conscious world. So, just one more time for the people, where can they find you?
Yeah, my website is markcharles2020.com. You can donate to our campaign there. You can sign up to volunteer with us. You can get on our virtual street team. If you want to find out our ballot access plan in your state, click on ballot access, and you can find out our plan for your state and what we're going to be doing in your state for voting. Watch our announcement videos on our website. We're also on social media. You can find us on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, and even on TikTok. So we're on as many of these social medias as we can get on. And please connect with us. Please share us. Please follow us. And remember, if you want change, if you really want systemic change, you're going to have to write the name in. Mark Charles. It's never going to be a checkbox.
Mark Charles, independent presidential candidate. Thank you so much again for coming on. To everybody else,
thank you.